Hello, people. We are live here. I just have this stream opened on two screens, so I want to just make sure that the system is working in the manner I desire it to. Okay, good. Good. Okay. Today will be probably a little bit of a shorter stream than we've had the past couple weeks. I'm thinking it'll be about an hour. Might be a little longer than an hour, so not too much shorter than we've had before. I want to begin with a word of prayer as people begin to filter in. By the way, the dog is, as usual, present and loud, so he may interrupt a few times. By the way, Sarah from Hamilton Clips, would you just send me an email at sarahfromhamilton@gmail.com? I just want to, I really am very happy that you have the channel set up as you do. I really appreciate it. I don't have a problem with anything that you're doing. I just want to ask you some things about some of, you sent me something. Gotcha. Okay. Anyway, illumine our hearts, O Master, who lovest mankind with the pure light of thy divine knowledge. Open the eyes of our mind to the understanding of thy gospel teachings. Implant also in us the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down our carnal desires may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things as are well-pleasing unto thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God. Unto thee do we ascribe glory, together with thy Father, who is everlasting, and in all holy good and life-creating Spirit, both now and ever, to the ages of ages. Amen. Okay. So for those who have just arrived, or I don't know how many people, I usually get around 30 to 50 people in a live stream at any given time. I don't know how many of those are the same people who come to most live streams, or whether it's different people who come to the live stream. So if you haven't been to one of these before, what I do is 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I will stream for about an hour and a half. The official length is 1 to 3 hours, but it pretty much always tends to be, or always has tended to be, about an hour and a half. I don't at this point have a time which I'm willing to say is my regular time. I will, if I schedule the stream formally on YouTube in advance, probably mark something like 3 p.m. as the beginning time. Hopefully, that will be moved up to about 1 p.m. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, though it's possible. I haven't looked at YouTube analytics. It's possible that 3 p.m. is just an objectively better time. That's Eastern Standard Time. Today, we're beginning at about 4:40 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I appreciate everyone being here. Also, the content of these live streams at this point is going to be focused on just answering questions that I get via Super Chat and also via Patreon. So my Patreon is patreon.com/Cabane. That's Kabane, which used to be my YouTube handle as well. Again, it doesn't mean anything. It's just I came up with it when I was in 4th grade because it sounded like kabam, because I was a boy who liked explosions. So if you are a member of tiers 2 or 3, that means that you can send in one question through Patreon messages every month, and I will answer that question during one of the live streams that I do 3 times a week. So I just keep a running list of questions. I don't necessarily answer them in the exact order I receive them, because it kind of depends on what I feel like I have the most to say about at any given moment. But roughly speaking, I answer them in the order in which I receive them, particularly when it comes to Super Chat. So I do guarantee answers to all Super Chats, not necessarily in the same stream, because we're not doing 10, 12-hour streams anymore. We're doing 1 to 3 hour streams. So I don't necessarily guarantee you an answer in the same stream in which you ask, but I do guarantee an answer in some stream. And usually the answers are pretty detailed and extensive, and they initiate tangents and various other kinds of discussions that we have here. Also, I do answer questions that aren't Super Chats if I really feel like answering them, but I don't guarantee answers to those questions. Obviously, that's not feasible to do. So let's get to the first of these questions. Sorry about the dog. Puggy, hold on. I have to put him in a more feasible position. Okay, so I was just engaged in a contest of wills with the dog. I was victorious. So now Puggy is going to be sitting right here. He probably will make noises, but there's really nothing I can do about that. So I do apologize for that. I think. Let's see. Oh, I also wanted to just talk a little bit about potential future stuff that I'm that I'm going to do um, on these streams and elsewhere. Um, Whenever I look to the side, it's always Puggy's doing something here. Um, so as I get more regular in investing time into this channel, as we've been doing so far, I do want to add in or build in a couple of additional things in addition to just the kind of generic Q&A streams. One thing I'd like to do in the future, and I'm saying all this because I'm asking for your thoughts, whether it's something you would like to see or whether it's not really something you'd like to see. One thing I would like to do is to start doing more book discussions of some things that I'm reading. So right now I'm reading a interesting book. It's probably going to be reversed on the screen, I think, but might not be. I can't remember what my setting is right now. It's called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. So when I finish this, I want to do a discussion just on the content of this book, some of the insights that it has, and so on and so forth. What it's about the way in which early Christianity spread throughout the Roman world. Um, and it's about the theology of patience that developed in the early church. And he points out something that's pretty interesting, which is that, within the first 3 centuries of Christian history, you don't have a single treatise that's written on, for example, the idea of mission. And we tend to think of Christianity as spreading primarily through missionary work, but that's not really the case. Missionaries tend to operate by planting churches in new regions, and then it's those churches which are instrumental in growing throughout the threads which make up any given society. So, for example, Christianity in the global South really grew after the colonial era was brought to a conclusion, and after these churches, which had been planted by Europeans, came to be governed by the people who actually lived there. And once that happened, Christianity spread along the threads of the social networks which made up the constitution of those societies. But it's interesting that there's no early Christian treatise on the theology of mission, but there's 3 early Christian treatises on the theology of patience. So I hope to have a discussion on this book when I finish it, which will probably be sometime by God's will early next week. One other thing that I would like to do is to do little shorts. I say shorts, but I don't actually know how long a short is, so I'm going to look that up real quick. Well, they're 60 seconds, which is kind of lame. If they were 5 minutes, that would be more feasible. But I'd like to do shorter videos talking about a little detail of a passage of scripture or something. I've had ideas like that in the past, but it always turns into like a 40, 50-minute video. So I really would like to figure out how to cut that down and start producing much shorter videos so that I can upload stuff even on days where I'm not doing live streams, which is just it's better for me, it's better for the channel. Uh it's better for everyone. So Okay, so that I think is all I wanted to say in terms of yeah, housekeeping stuff. So someone asks, and welcome to people who are just coming in. Again, I do answer all super chats, not necessarily though, oftentimes in the same stream. Okay, so someone asked this question. When I was into occult practices, we used a lot of similar language in regards to transcendence and the knowledge of the divine, such as seeing beyond the veil, etc., etc. What distinguishes hesychasm's use versus Eastern practice? And by Eastern practice, I think the questioner means stuff like in the Orient, things related to Buddhism, things related to Old World Indian culture, and also, I think, in a broader sense, just the general New Age kind of thing. Well, the first thing I would say about this is that the fact that these practices appear to be related to each other is not an accident. There are certain things that are internal to the wiring and constitution of the human person, which means that the way in which one might bring the body under discipline or gain dominion over all aspects of one's bodily life are going to be analogous whether you're talking about a Christian or a non-Christian tradition. But I think the main point we have to make here is that one does not bring the body under discipline for its own sake in Christianity. The point is not simply to exercise dominion over all members of one's body. One exercises dominion over all members of one's body because one is looking to allow Christ, through the Holy Spirit, to dwell in and permeate all members of one's body. It is one thing to bring the body under discipline, but that can be counterproductive if, in fact, you don't know what you're bringing the body under discipline for. So that's point one, that there are analogous processes by which one might empty oneself in various traditions, because the process for emptying oneself is not arbitrarily given. It is something which is given and is the way that it is because God knows the way in which the body is constituted, and thus certain things can simply be discovered by empirical trial and error, no matter what culture or tradition you come from. Also, some of these processes, uh, uh, being what they are, can be revealed by a supernatural source which is not God. I mean, the devils will use true knowledge more than they would use just straight up lies. All things being equal, if they can accomplish their goal by using true information, they will do that because truth is just more powerful than just straight up falsehood. I mean, this is the thing with propaganda in general, right? A propagandist would prefer to use true information to the rather than just making things up. If it so happens that a given fact is conducive to the agenda one wants to advance, you'd have to be really foolish not to use a fact to advance that agenda. In any case, there's certain things about the wiring of the creation and the wiring of the human being which are true, but which aren't useful or good for a person to know at any given moment or at a given moment. So the occult generally is associated with, and I think this is the meaning of the word secrets, right? It's about acquiring insight into the underlying nature and constitution of reality. So we have the visible world, which we experience in corporeal terms. We experience it through the wiring of our body, but everything visible has several underlying layers, which are not immediately apparent to a person who's only seeing with corporeal eyes. Now, those underlying layers, the deeper you get into the nature of a thing, the deeper you go, the more influence you're able to have in relation to that particular thing, right? Because the deeper you go into a thing, the more fundamental or foundational that layer is going to be to what the thing is overall, right? So if I make a mark on somebody's skin, if I scratch their skin, it will hurt, but it's not going to destroy them or have that much of effect on them. But if I make that same scratch on their heart, it's going to affect every aspect of their body. And so if you just take, let's say, take anything. If you want to have dominion over that thing, if you want to use that thing for everything that it is and all the energies it possesses, it requires insight into its deeper nature, not just what is immediately apparent with one's bodily eyes. That deeper nature is constituted by the logos of a thing. So that is what ultimately makes a thing what it is. It's logos. Well, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is associated with the occult or secrets and things like that, because in a sense, that's precisely what it is. It is a person acquiring knowledge of the logi of things before they are prepared really to assimilate that knowledge and to use it wisely. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil because, number one, it's the tree of kingship and dominion. Okay? A king is a cultivator of the world. A king, in virtue of having sovereignty over the world, can make it what he wishes it to be. Having authority over a particular land, he can determine that this land is zoned for agriculture, and this land is zoned for industry, and this land is zoned for residence, and so on and so forth. And simply by his word, he's able to reshape the land and make it look very, very different than what it looked like 10 years prior. So a king is a creator, a king is a developer of the world. In order to wisely develop the world, one has to have a good sense of where one is going and what a wise course of action is going to be. But you could, in principle, have certain knowledge which allows you to creatively mold the world without having the wisdom that's necessary to actually choose to mold it in the right direction. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is, number one, a tree of kingship, because the phrase knowledge of good and evil, knowledge to discern between good and evil, is used throughout the Bible to refer to kings. So we see this in at the end of Genesis. Joseph has wisdom to discern between good and evil. King Solomon prays for wisdom to discern between good and evil. King David is like the angel of the Lord, like Christ, in other words. This is a phrase that's used in the book of Samuel. He's like the angel of the Lord with the wisdom to discern between good and evil. In Isaiah 7, one way we know that Isaiah 7, the prophecy of Emmanuel, is a messianic prophecy is because it uses this language. When the boy is old enough to reject the evil and choose the good, i.e., he is old enough to actually sit and rule on the throne, and thus do what the king is supposed to do on behalf of all Israel. It's one way we know it's a messianic prophecy. There are many other ways we know it's a messianic prophecy. But I think the reason that this knowledge of good and evil language is used in reference to kingship is because we're not just talking about goodness in the sense of moral goodness. These words have a much more extended meaning than that. So if I want to make a telephone call to somebody, this phone is good for that. That doesn't mean this phone is morally good. It might be a bad telephone call I want to make. But it's good for that because it's suited to the purpose I desire to realize in the world. This notebook is bad for that. I can't make a phone call with the notebook. So it's bad. Well, in order to know that, I actually have to have some acquaintance with what these things are and what they do. If I have some acquaintance with what they are and what they do, what they're made for and how they're wired, I'm able to carry out my purpose through them more effectively. And finally, I think the knowledge of good and evil is also a merism. So a merism is something, so if I say good and evil, that includes absolutely everything, because a thing is either suited or unsuited for its purpose, and it's suited or unsuited to varying degrees. If I say it's raining or it's not raining, that includes all possible realities with respect to the question of whether it's raining or not. So a merism is like when you use two opposites in order to capture the sense that you're talking about everything. So consuming the tree of the knowledge of good and evil gives you insight into the entire nature of reality because it brings you into direct acquaintance with the divine logos. Being brought into direct acquaintance with the divine logos and seeing the forms of all creatures therein is not necessarily a good thing. It can be far too much to handle. This is something that people talk about when they take certain kinds of psychedelic drugs. Interestingly, the research on psychedelic drugs seems to demonstrate that while you would expect on the naturalist theory of psychedelic drugs, which I strongly discourage everyone from taking for a variety of reasons, but if you on the naturalist theory or the materialist theory of psychedelic drugs, where these things are being produced by the brain, you would expect a high amount of brain activity in the regions associated with sight and actual hallucinations and things like that. But actually, we find that there's a decrease in brain activity in those areas, not an increase, even though people are seeing extremely sophisticated and vivid images oftentimes. Well, what's actually going on there? Well, I think because a certain part of the brain which is associated with apprehending and recognizing what's directly in front of your eyes is being kind of turned off or turned down. Actually, there are other areas of perception which are opened forcibly by the taking or ingesting of drugs. And it's very often far too much for a person to deal with, or a person gets part of the truth, but not the whole truth. And it's much more dangerous to have part of the truth, especially part of a very significant truth, than it is to have no truth at all. Because a person thinks that they have it figured out when in reality they might, in the more significant way, be even farther from what they're trying to get to than they were beforehand. So if a person after taking psychedelic drugs perceives innately, just by direct apprehension, the fundamental unity in all things, which is a pretty common experience that people describe after they take psychedelic drugs, um, of perceiving the fundamental unity in all things, well, in a sense, they're closer to the truth, but in another sense, they're much farther from it, because that unity isn't perceived in terms of Christ. And then what they've apprehended is that there is a unity, but they don't know what unity that's for or how to be properly related to it. And very often, what that leads to is a view of the world where one's personal identity is meant to be dissolved, which is, in fact, precisely the opposite of what Christianity calls us towards. Christianity calls for the unity of all things to include and incorporate us without our destruction. So, uh, to be united with Christ is to be made more real than one already is. The opposite of that is disintegration, and we would call that damnation in Christian theology. Okay. I'm just looking at some of the chats. See if there are super chats I can ask or answer really quickly. Mm. Someone did ask in a super chat whether I've read Christ the Eternal Tao. I have not, in fact, read Christ the Eternal Tao, so there's not much more to say for me to say beyond that. It's one of those books I really should read because everybody recommends it. It's supposed to be very good, so I ought to read it at some point, and I'll make a video about it or whatever. But no. Someone also asked, have I read Pavel Florensky? No, but my brother has. I know my brother has read Florensky. My brother actually so I did a couple interviews with Jake on his journey back to Christianity about a year ago. We didn't finish them. And part of the reason that I chose not to finish them at that point is because he hadn't yet. I believed that he would become Orthodox again. He hadn't yet done so, but I'm very happy to report that in the past week, he has again become a communicant in the Orthodox Church. So hopefully we'll be finishing those relatively soon in the next couple months or so, if he's available. But Jake, my brother, has read Florensky, and actually there is some Florensky downstairs. And that's another author that I ought to read. Okay. So, in any case, now one of the things that you do see in some of these esoteric traditions or in occultic traditions is the idea of heavenly ascent. And this is related actually to what I was saying about psychedelic. And people talk about ayahuasca, they'll ingest ayahuasca in a ritual context. They undergo a process of heavenly ascent to a heavenly temple where they meet these celestial beings who tell them certain things about reality. And then they return to the world with the knowledge they've received allegedly through that process. Well, this is exactly what you see happening in the Garden of Eden in a negative sense. The Garden of Eden is structured so that you have at the bottom of the garden, the garden is on a mountain. So you have, just say, Mount Eden. At the bottom, you have, this is where Cain and Abel dwells. In the middle of the garden, you have this lush area, which is the garden itself, the garden proper. But you ascend upwards beyond that, and you find the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life, and you find the heavenly council, and then God's throne in the center. So the idea of making a heavenly ascent and meeting members of a heavenly council who will give you wisdom or knowledge is a better word to use in this context, which you will then use to implement in the world, is a very kind of it's a very widespread, in a sense, it's a very biblical resonance, but the more intensely spiritual, the more intensely related to truth a thing is, the more dangerous it can be when it's even slightly misused. So this is kind of what I was saying about scratching someone's skin versus scratching their heart. Even minor alterations, even minor twistings in the most fundamental of truths will have very, very substantial downstream effects. You pollute a spring, you're going to affect much more water than if you just pollute downstream of the river. This, by the way, I think is why we should understand the church to be so stingy about matters of Trinitarian and Christological orthodoxy. And I say stingy, obviously, in an ironic sense. Why is the church so insistent that we get the theology of the Trinity and the Incarnation exactly and precisely right? Why is it so insistent that the filioque is a matter of very serious theological freight? Well, I think it's because these deal with the heart of reality. The only kind of existence that there fundamentally is, the only kind of existence which is intrinsic is divine existence. God alone is self-existent, and the only God there is God the Holy Trinity. God self-exists as Father, and as Father, he begets the Son from eternity. That's intrinsic to his fatherhood. And then the relation between the two is one of gift-giving and love and charity. And so the Father produces the person of the Holy Spirit as a gift for the Son. And so that is all of reality right there. Describing that in an inaccurate way or perceiving that in an inaccurate way will have lots of downstream consequences in one's theology, which one doesn't even realize or recognize. I'm not claiming to give a comprehensive list of those consequences. I'm only saying that it makes a great deal of sense that we take specifically the doctrine of the Trinity and the Incarnation so seriously, because the Trinity is the basis of all reality, and the Incarnation is the basis of all glorification. That's the way in which we are joined to the life of the triune God. See what else we have. I'm going to take the next chat in order. Think if there's anything else I want to say on this first question that I had. Well, give me 1 second, actually. I'm going to pause for a moment. Okay. Actually, uh, Wesson Chow. I don't know how to pronounce exactly that, but Naden Trey. Uh, let me send you a message after I finish the stream. But I have gotten your message just now. Okay. So next question: do I believe in a golden age slash future utopia? Now, the name of this the gentleman who asked the question is post millennial integralist. So I imagine that it's related to post millennialism. So yes, I do. I actually think that it's arguable, at the very least. I would go further, but I'll just be. I'll say it's arguable that a number of the passages in the early fathers that are alleged to refer to a historic premillennial view, which is historic premillennialism, for those who aren't familiar, is the view that the millennium is an actual, concrete, literal 1,000-year period prior to the world to come, but after the second coming. That's why it's called premillennialism. Premillennialism is the view that the second coming precedes the millennium. Historic premillennialism is that view, and it's not dispensationalist. So that's why it's historic. It's historic and not dispensational, which is more recent. But I actually think a lot of the patristic passages that are alleged to refer to historic premillennial eschatology probably instead refer to what postmillennialists, and that term is specifically taken from the manifestation of this tradition in the Reformed world, though there are plenty of representatives of the view that all nations are going to be converted and sanctified and discipled prior to the return of Christ, which generally aren't classified under postmillennial because that refers to a tradition within Reformed theology. But if you just look at representatives of the ancient medieval church, you will find that view out there, even though it's not classified under that heading. I've said before, someone needs to do a dissertation on postmillennialism in the fathers and the medieval theologians of East and West, because it actually is a lot more prominent than you would expect it to be. I have some friends and acquaintances who have done some more research on that than I have, but it's really interesting. In any case, for example, when Papias quotes that saying of Jesus, it's a non-canonical saying. It's not found in the canonical Gospels, but he quotes it by reference to a tradition from the Apostle John, where Jesus speaks of the immense fertility of the Messianic age, and it doesn't appear that he's referring to the world that's after the second coming. I think that when we understand that the wiring of the world runs through the human heart, really and objectively and truly, it runs through mankind. A human family, which is for whom obedience is the rule rather than disobedience, is a human family which has a tremendous impact on the way that the world functions. So you just think um, of the way that Saint Seraphim of Sarov related to the non-human world. Animals didn't need to be taught or told to become humble and non-aggressive and to accept food from his hand. They simply did intuitively, because the wiring of the world runs through the human heart and runs to the animal world and the rest of the world. Saint Seraphim Sarab also spoke into existence a plant. He called it up out of the ground and it just emerged. So what would it look like? I mean, because we know, just conceivably speaking, in terms of possible worlds language, we know it is possible for every human being at any given point to choose by the grace of the Holy Spirit, holiness and obedience and righteousness and so on and so forth. So what would the world actually look like if that was the rule and not the exception? What if sainthood was recognized and expressed for what it really is, which is normal human life, rather than an exception to the rule? Well, if that happened, we would see a world which looked very, very different from the world that we encounter now, the world that we're used to now. I think in the biblical prophets, the prophets seem to look towards an age during the reign of the Messianic king where there is still, in some sense, death, but where the power of death has been very, very significantly driven back. So Isaiah says in Isaiah 66 that in the days of the Messianic age, the one who dies at 100 years old will have been said to have died a young man. Well, just as death advanced its claim gradually over generations, just as death gradually drove down human lifespan from unending to 900 years to 500 years, 215 years, down to present rates of 3 score and 10, or even by reason of strength, 4 score. Well, so also the Messianic kingdom advances against death. Now, God has launched an offensive. Since the coming of Christ, God has not been operating in secret. God has mustered his troops and has launched his invasion and has assaulted the gates of Hades. And the progress of the conflict, though that goes up and down, is decidedly in his favor. If you compare where the kingdom was in 200 AD, compare where it is now. He's now launching offensives on multiple fronts at once. And, while the gates of Hades may have launched a counterattack in the Western world, meanwhile, they're losing their battles in pretty much every other front. Well, if you recognize that the trajectory of history seems to be moving in that direction, and if you recognize the kind of comprehensive or cosmic effects of what obedience means, well, then I think you can conceive of why Papias, or Jesus, who's being quoted by Papias, would conceive of the world in the Messianic age as a world of immense fertility and fruitfulness and so on and so forth. So we can call that a golden age. We can call it a future utopia. We can call it the latter day glory of the church, whatever you want to call it. I think that a lot of the passages in the early fathers that are taken by many to refer to a historic premillennial eschatology are actually referring to something much more like that. There's the tradition which you find in many early Christian sources of the creation week being interpreted, in addition to its concrete interpretation of 6 actual creation days followed by sabbatical rest, in a spiritual sense, a 6 millennia followed by a sabbatical millennium. If you look at Saint Bede the Venerable's work on the chronology of world history, he takes the 7th day sabbatical millennium as referring to the spiritual state associated with resting in Christ and the church that kind of advances into and moves into history and establishes its claim in historical time. And then that leads into the 8th day, which is the world to come. This is the world in which death has been completely abolished and everyone has been resurrected from the dead and live in glorified bodies. So the short answer to this question is yes. Here, just making sure I can keep up with the super chats. Okay. What was I saying? Oh, yes. Revelation 20. Just read you the passage because I'm going to comment on it. Revelation 20 referring to the millennium, the binding of Satan. So 20 verse 1, I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and the accuser, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. Okay, so here, as James Jordan points out, what you have is a network of references to Matthew 16. So here we have number 1. You have this bottomless pit. That is Sheol. That's the grave. That's Hades. In Revelation itself, this pit is called Hades. Matthew 16, Jesus refers to the gates of Hades, which will not prevail against the church. Number 2, you have a key. Well, Matthew 16 refers to the keys of the kingdom of heaven, which are given through Peter to the church. Number 3, you have the devil who is present here. Okay, this is obviously referred to in the gates of Hades. The devil is also present right after Jesus speaks this word to Peter, because when Peter speaks, Jesus refers to him as Satan. And then right afterwards, when Jesus ascends the Mount of Transfiguration, he comes back down, he casts out a devil. So here we see the geography of the world. We have the mountain, it's the church. Jesus is enthroned in glory there. Peter, James, and John, representing the clergy, surround Jesus. They descend from the holy mountain. And then the devil is at the bottom of the holy mountain. This is where he is crouching at the door or crouching at the gate. Jesus defeats the devil there and then continues his advance. And Jesus, it says, he firmly set his face in the Gospel of Luke to go to Jerusalem. This is the outward advance of the kingdom as he moves to annul, in Isaiah's words, Israel's covenant with death. Someone asked if short lifespans are good for our spiritual lives so as to not grow too attached to this world. They are, but so, death itself is in part a remedial measure. the sanctification and training of the human will in obedience begins to obviate the need for these remedial measures. So in itself, a long life is better than a shorter life. This is clear in Scripture that a long life is a blessing, but every blessing is also a danger. So being a teacher is a blessing, but it's also a danger. Wealth is a blessing, but it's proportionately dangerous. As the human will is habituated in obedience, and when I say the human will, I'm referring to that single power of willing which belongs as one to the entirety of human nature and thus is shared by every member of the human family. Well, the more the human will is habituated in obedience, the more the need for remedial punishments like that is obviated, so that person can use longer lifespans to do more good rather than to be enslaved to evil. Okay, so Revelation 20, the keys of the kingdom. You've got the binding of Satan. Well, Jesus says that the keys of the kingdom are to bind and loose. Also, here Satan is loosed after 1,000 years. This also refers back to the key of David, which Jesus holds in Revelation 2-3. The key of David shuts so that nothing, so that it might not be open, and open so that it might not be shut. Well, here, this key is used to bind Satan, Matthew 16, and to shut the pit over him, i.e. Isaiah 22. So we see these texts combined here as they are in many other contexts. And then St. John says, I saw thrones. That's a quotation from Daniel 7. So the entirety of the book of Revelation takes place in the heavenly sanctuary, the heavenly liturgy, the heavenly council. And it takes place in the context of the vision of Daniel 7. Daniel 7 itself is a vision of what's going on in the heavenly courtroom when the Son of Man receives power and authority and honor and dominion to rule over the creation. Well, the entirety of the book of Revelation, in a sense, is showing the fulfillment of this vision of Daniel 7. I saw thrones is a phrase that's also used in Revelation 4-5. Jesus himself sits on a throne with the Father, and here the church is brought up to dwell in the place that Christ dwells, thus fulfilling the word in John's Gospel. I go to prepare a place for you so that where I am, you may be also. I saw thrones, seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also, I saw the thrones of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and the word of God. They're called beheaded here because in Revelation 7, they are marked on their head. In Numbers, I think it's Numbers 5, we've got the Nazarite vow. The English translations generally say dedicated hair, but the removal of one's hair signifies in the theology of Numbers the actual removal or consecration of one's head, i.e. the entirety of one's life, because the head is the capital of one's whole body. For them to be beheaded is to show in visionary form what it means to complete one's Nazarite vow. So they're referred to as beheaded, i.e. they complete the work that they promised to do in and through Christ. For the testimony of Jesus, for the word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast or its image, or had not received its mark on their foreheads or on their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were ended. This was the first, or this is the first resurrection. So this is the communion of saints. Those who are beheaded are those who complete their Nazarite vow to God. When we're baptized, we are consecrated and anointed on our foreheads. This is a kind of extension of the Nazarite vow, whereby we consecrate our entire mind and heart to God. And it says in Revelation 14 about these people that blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, and they rest from their labors, and their deeds follow them. And what are their deeds? But the deeds that Christ does in them, which is why the robes that they're given here are elsewhere called, I think in Revelation 22, the righteous deeds of the saints, and elsewhere these robes are the very same robes that are worn by Christ. So they their deeds follow them because they are deeds done in Christ, or deeds that Christ does in them. But we find that these are those who have died in the Lord and now sit in the heavenly sanctuary and share in the rule of Christ and are instrumental in the implementation of the kingdom in this world. But the point in making all of my point in bringing up this passage is to illuminate the nature of this key. What exactly is going on in the millennium? In the sense, the millennium begins the moment the church enters into the world and begins its attack. But the degree to which the millennium is realized in the world, and the degree to which Satan is shut away and is restrained from acting in the world, depends on the church's fidelity to God. The keys of the kingdom, or the key of David, is something which is given in a liturgical context. This is why it immediately precedes Jesus' ascent up the heavenly mountain in Matthew chapter 17. And this is why in Isaiah 22, the one who receives the key of David is wearing high priestly vestments. Remember, the temple is a palace. It's God's palace, and David's palace is, in a sense, David's temple. So the one who has authority over the physical house of David is analogous to the high priest. A priest, or a Cohen, Peter Leithart has argued, means just servant of God's house, servant of God's palace. And so when the church is faithful, more and more the life of the millennium enters into this creation and becomes more concretely realized. And the degree to which it is unfaithful, particularly in the liturgical context, is the degree to which the devil is enabled to continue acting in the world. And so I think this gives some context theologically to why St. Bede the Venerable speaks of the sabbatical millennium as, in some sense, overlapping with the life of this world, and then leading directly into the eighth day of the world to come. So the short answer to your question is, I do believe in a future golden age, or future utopia, a utopia rather. But that's something which develops and grows up through time. I don't think it's the transition is necessarily just like that. Okay. Someone asked me, do I see as correct the new perspective on Paul view that ergon nomu, works of the law, refers exclusively to specific works in the Torah, and thus concerns who can be a member of the covenant community, and not to the later debate on works righteousness? Not really. I think works of the Torah refers to the works that the Torah does. Okay, I think when it talks about, are we justified by the pistus Jesu Christu? Are we justified pistis Jesu Christo? Christu? Are we justified by the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, or by the works of the Torah? Well, I think this is referring to both of these contrasting options as active agents in a person. Thus, Galatians, it is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faithfulness of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. So faithfulness and love, these are both things the Son of God does. Thus, later in Galatians 5:6, what matters is not circumcision nor uncircumcision, but faith working through love. Faith working through love is important because faith working through love is the life of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me and lives in me and is doing things in me. And that's not, as C.S. Lewis points out, this is not just like a cute turn of phrase. It's not just a way of referring to imitating Christ. To say Christ lives in you and is doing things captures a very real, you might say literal, reality about the way that things actually work. Works of the Torah, I think, refer to works the Torah does. So just take a look at Romans 7, the way that Paul speaks of Torah in Romans chapter 7. You have to find the exact passage I'm thinking of. Okay, that's actually not going to be very succinct to quote all of that. So I'll just say Romans 5, the Torah came to increase the trespass. So what are the works of the Torah? Works of the Torah, I think, are the works that the Torah does in you. Works that the Torah does in you. It's not works that are prescribed in the Torah primarily, but things that Torah is doing. And that is why the contrast is the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. I also think that while certain works that are ceremonial in nature might be particularly in view in Galatians, that's not what works of the Torah means. Works of the Torah means the entire Torah, because the entire Torah is given as a single covenant which governs God's relationship with Israel, and has a particular purpose. That's why Paul speaks of the goal of the Torah. He says the goal of the Torah is the Messiah. And its purpose is to increase the activity of death and flesh so that all of those things might be drawn together on one point, placed on the shoulders of Christ, carried away by Christ, and then reborn according to the Spirit, reborn in his resurrection from the dead. So, no, the works of the Torah means the whole Torah, and this is what we see in Galatians 3, where Paul says that if you rely on the works of the Torah, you got to do the whole thing perfectly, or else you're dead, literally, because life is only found in God. And to deviate even slightly from something or someone who is infinite is to deviate infinitely. So there's an infinite chasm which has been created between God and man, even by the slightest sin. It isn't God being arbitrary or cruel, it's just in the nature of the case. So if one is relying on the flesh and one has no way to pass through death unto resurrection, then it has to be done with absolute and total perfection. And because the human family is a single organism, that's not even within our power. That's not within our power to do, because we are who we are by virtue of our relations to everyone else, including Adam himself. So the human family is a single organism. It's not as if we can choose to be totally faithful, because we don't choose. We don't have the complete power to constitute our selfhood. It's constituted through plenty of things and plenty of people whose wills lie outside of our control. So that is why Jesus, having become incarnate as the only begotten Son in a human nature, communicates his own divine life to our life and makes up an infinite chasm by having infinite life in humanity. And he dies the death that the Torah is invariably going to drive towards. And in dying that death and returning from the dead, he allows death to be a door through which we can pass to new life. And that is why repentance is meaningful, because we die to one thing and we live to something else. And we are always able to be dying to one thing and living to something else, because that path has already been carved through Christ. But the short answer is I don't believe, no, that it's just works of the ceremonial law, or I think it's the entire Torah. I do have actually Keaton, sorry. I think Keaton is how you pronounce it. I do have a couple of videos on this that I did pretty soon after my debate with Matt Slick. So those videos are called, I think, Works of the Law in the Old Testament, Works of the Law in the New Testament. So I have one video for each testament where I talk about this idea. But I think once you have it in your head that works of the Torah means the works that the Torah does in you, it's something that where the Torah is the active agent. It's not just something the Torah gives you to do. I think a lot of stuff in Paul becomes a lot clearer. Okay. Let's go to that. I wonder if I have it here. Oh, give me 1 second. I just want to answer a question by using a visual aid. Well, I mean, in a way, leading to death is the point. Someone said very memorably, Christ didn't die so that we could live. He dies so that we can die and live so that we might live. Paul says the Torah came to increase the trespasser. God says to Isaiah that he's speaking his word to and through Isaiah in order to increase the workings of idolatry in Israel. So I have a video, I think it's about a 20-minute video on the way in which God brings life out of death or good out of evil. And one of the things that God does, knowing that evil is self-immolating, knowing that evil will always lead to its own destruction, because evil simply is to depart from the life of God, which is the only kind of life that there is, meaning it depends on leeching off of something which was created for some other purpose, which means the farther it departs from God, the less power it has, which means if you make evil worse very, 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 very quickly, if God takes evil and he makes it worse by speaking into the world, causing people to embrace their evil if they reject him, causing them to harden their hearts if they reject him, it actually leads to their own destruction because it's counterproductive. You need to have a continuing connection to some kind of good if you're going to have power to really do evil. It's one thing to be bad, but still have certain good intentions. It's another thing to be entirely through and through evil. You're just frozen. You have no power to do anything anymore. It's self-destructive. And that means that evil can never reach its goal. It will always run out of fuel before it reaches where it's trying to go, because where it's trying to go is the negation of all good, but good is the fuel on which it's running. Okay, so I do have to go in a few minutes. I know today's been a little bit of a shorter stream than the past several, but I want to get to one or two more questions. Oh yeah, that's why I went over. What are some of my favorite prayer books or resources? The one I like, I use most often in terms of a physical prayer book is this like pocket edition of the prayer book in Psalms. It was given to me by one of my godchildren. It's published by Jordanville. I like it because it's small, physically small, and you can carry it around with you very easily. Also like because it has all the Psalms in there, and the Psalms are great. Everyone should use the Psalms more. And I like it because it has, the basic kind of essentials. But more than that, I've tended just to use kind of things which are compiled on the internet. Akathist hymns I really like. Canons are really kind of doable if you want to like do something daily. You want to pray for something specific on a regular basis. A canon is pretty doable. It's relatively short, and it's thus able to be more consistent. So that's what I would say about that. Someone also asks, I've been made aware by Craig, I think Craig Trulia, I don't know though, that some Protestants criticize Nicaea II's scholarship, language, and poor argumentation. What are your thoughts on that criticism? Well, in order to really give my thoughts on that, I would have to know more about the specific criticism which is being brought up, but I can say some things generally. And the first thing that I would say is that the same methodology which is used to dismiss many patristic texts as spurious is the methodology that biblical scholars use to dismiss many of the books of the New Testament as spurious or as being forged under the name of someone who didn't really write it. Many conservative Protestant scholars seem to be willing to simply take the academic consensus this is not just true for Protestants, it's true in general, but in this context, I'm talking about Protestant scholars, seem to be willing to take the academic consensus for granted as if it was self-evidently true, as long as it doesn't directly contradict some fundamental tenet of our faith. The problem with that is that if our faith is totally true, and if the academic consensus routinely contradicts the fundamental principles of our faith, that entails that those consensuses are false. And if consensuses can be so straightforwardly false so often, it indicates that it's not just an incidental problem where it happens to contradict some fundamental tenet of our faith. It's a problem which is endemic to the academic project as a whole, as it's practiced right now, which suggests we should be less reliant on academic consensuses in taking for granted what is and isn't true or normative in a particular context. And so I think, we really need someone or a group of people to go through these texts, which are alleged to be not authentically written by the various fathers to whom they've historically been attributed, and just ask the question: is this something that is based on good or sound or well-founded grounds, or is it something that we need to reassess? Now, spurious patristic texts are not. I mean, this is not a new kind of claim. It's not something which is just out of court from the beginning. It's something that was discussed in the ancient world, whether this or that text was actually written by the father to whom it's being attributed. But I think we need to have some kind of skepticism about whether we take for granted just what an academic consensus says on this or that point, especially when it can be circular in contexts like this. If you think that iconography is a relatively late development, then the presence of iconography in early patristic texts would seem to indicate that it's not an authentic patristic text. But then when you can't turn around and use that as a counter argument to Nicaea the Second's citation of this or that text by saying, well, it's spurious. Well, how do they know it's spurious? Well, in many cases, it's because it allegedly has late features. Well, what are those late features? Well, if the late feature is the veneration of icons, that's just a circular argument. So that's one example of the kind of poor argumentation that Nicaea II is alleged to have used. I also think we need to take more seriously the witness of someone like Eusebius, who clearly bears witness to the fact that the early church had images, and he's relaying traditions about sites which are much older than Eusebius himself. So Eusebius was obviously very close in time relative to where we are, to the first 3 centuries of Christian history. So when he says certain things about the way the church worked and what they had in those first 3 centuries, I think we need to take that seriously and not just wave it off, dismiss it, or, as is most common, just kind of ignore it or be unaware of it entirely. I think the same thing, by the way, about like the Edessa image. Edessa, not Odessa. The Edessa image that Jesus had made for the king of Edessa, and there's a letter which is said to be from Jesus that's written to the king of Edessa, and actually makes. One day I'll go through that letter in a video or on a stream or something, because it's a really interesting letter. But I have no problem whatsoever believing in the authenticity of that tradition. Okay, so the I've answered. So that final super chat that I have right now is what the problems I see with post-supersessionist theology are. So I'm going to save that to the next stream, because I want to give that a much more detailed answer than I really have time to give at the moment. I think he's speaking about people like Gerald McDermott, who wrote a book on this, and also someone like Mark Kinzer, who's a Messianic Jewish theologian. It's a really good question, and there's a lot of kind of subtleties that I want to be able to address. But for now, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to be back on. Okay, so this Friday, I don't know whether I'm going to have a Clubhouse. If I don't, then I'll just do a regular stream like this. If I do, well, then you'll see me on Clubhouse, and I will live stream it here as well. So as to when I'm going to be online Friday, I'll plan very tentatively for 2, but I'm going to update that if something changes that. So we'll see you on Friday. And I would also like some of your ideas on ideas for shorter videos and stuff that I can produce on quote unquote off days, on days where I'm not doing a live stream. So thank you all for coming. Please keep me in your prayers. Name is Seraphim, obviously. Also, please keep Magdalena in your prayers. So have those names liturgically commemorated. And by God's will, I will see you on Friday.